otherwise people get annoyed with me. So greetings, welcome. My name's Uma Dinsmore-Tuli, and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Yoga Nidra Network with Andre Holecek, author of Dream Yoga and Preparing to Die, and just like to me, one of the shining lights and guidance. I love his book, Dream Yoga. It's one of my favorite books, and it's just deep guidance, deep practice, and many other marvelous skills that I won't even begin to go into because you need to read his work if you haven't encountered it. Andrew, I have a question for you about Yoga Nidra.
Sure.
And in Yoga Nidra, there's an understanding of there's a goddess, Nidra Shakti, and in Dream Yoga also, I understand there are Dākinis and the presence of the Vajra Yogini within the practice of Dream Yoga, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about those things.
Yeah. So, well, a number of things to say. One is, in an overarching way, because I'm sure everybody who's listening, hopefully they know what Dākinis are, chondros, sky dancers, feminine and enlightened qualities. And maybe it's helpful to situate the nocturnal meditations, at least in the Tibetan arena, within the feminine principle, Dākini principle altogether. And that is that it is actually considered conducive to sleep, dream, and die, actually in a feminine state. Because especially when it comes to Bardo Yoga, you're returning to the lap of the primordial mother. In fact, I have a picture of her right here. Prajna Paramita, the mother of all the Buddhas. So when you die, you're returning, interestingly enough, into a kind of a feminine state, or using different iconography, Samantabhadri, who in the Bardo teachings, of course, is in union with Samantabhadra, union of luminosity and emptiness, really the parents of reality. And so I think that's helpful to state at the outset. And so therefore, several ways this is implemented in Dream Yoga and Sleep Yoga. One is, and by the way, Sleep Yoga is not quite the same as Yoga Nidra, even though you're using the same signifier, the signified is not the same. So we can talk a little bit more about that if you want later. But one of the ways this is worked with, as you know, is even the way you take your posture to go to sleep, right? So it's considered conducive to sleep, dream, die in the mudra, the Simha Mudra. The Buddha took this posture allegedly when he died, right? You see many pictures of him lying on his right side. And what you do is you assume this posture, you lie down on your right side. If you can do it, you block off your right nostril. And what that does is, it, in a subtle inner yogic way, is, Dream Yoga, by the way, is an inner yoga in the Tibetan arena. It works with the inner subtle body, which is the support, the correlate to the inner subtle dreaming mind. And so by lying down on the right side, you're blocking off the Rasana channel, which is an outgoing masculine energy, more in the world, active, manifesting kind of energy. And in so doing, by blocking off the right nadi with your hand against your right nostril in the posture, you're also then inviting, it's called sun poison prana, by the way. That kind of prana that flows through that channel is called sun poison prana. So you want to block that off, and you want to open up the lalana, the left channel, which is moon nectar prana, which is feminine. And so in my language, I playfully say, sun poison prana is bad breath in the inner yogas, right? Because when you're going to sleep, that is not the time to be out in the world. That now's the time to be more lunar, interior, introspective, and therefore feminine. And so I think at the outset that's helpful to state, because while Tibetan Buddhism, and there is a difference between Tibetan Buddhism and Burden Buddhism, like many people know, and I'm a huge fan and good friends with Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche in his beautiful book, Tibetan Yogas of Sleep, Dream and Sleep. In that lineage, which is similar but not the same to the Kagyu Nyingma Sakya Gelug traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, they have their Dakini, as you know, they have a way to supplicate, to work with that Dakini energy. But there isn't one in Tibetan Buddhism and dream yoga. And I have queried teachers. I've asked some very high lamas and rinpoches, like, hey, am I like you? It's like, am I missing something? Do we have a Dakini? And they said no. And so, but here we get the tradition, I think, in a certain way, I wouldn't say it's better, but there are a number of lineages of dream yoga in the Tibetan Buddhism. There's the lineage of Padmasambhava, the 6 Bardo teachings, Nima relation, set of practices. And then there are the Kagyu practices, what are called the Naro Chudra, the 6 yogas of Naropa. And while I have facility in both of those, my training in my 3-year retreat was with the 6 yogas, the Naro Chudra, so the Karma Kagyu. And so in that tradition, you do dream yoga as Vajrayogini. So you actually arise. It's actually part of the infrastructure practice prior to actually doing dream yoga. So the 6 yogas they're considered the crown jewels of the Kagyu tradition. Incredibly profound set of practices. And the first main practice, literally the moniker is the main beam, is the Chandali, Tumo, the inner heat practices. All the other practices really are based upon that. And starting with Chandali, and then in particular reiterated at the outset of each of the other practices, you begin each one of these as Vajrayogini. And so you arise as the Dakini. You do what's called self-visualization, self-generation. I have a beautiful tanka of her, not quite within reach, but she's semi-wrathful. You know what she looks like. She's amazing, right? She's the hottest chick on the market, right? I love her. And she has just, this skull cup and razor blade, this hook knife in her right hand. You don't want to mess with her, right? You don't mess with Vajrayogini. She's great. So you arise as her. And therefore, when you're doing dream yoga, even though there is not an overt analog like there is to the Bun Buddhist tradition, in fact, you do arise as the Dakini, as the Yidam. And so therefore, parenthetically, and then I'll come off for air and we can take this anywhere you want. There are other practices, as you know, where masculine principle also comes into play, right? So even though the Dakini isn't there in the same way as the Bun tradition, when you're doing dream yoga and you're engaging the inner yogas using a throat visualization, on the 4 petals, which I do have here, you visualize this at your throat center, right? You know this. And each one of these bija syllables, seed syllables, is of course a seed syllable to one of the 5 jhana Buddhas, the 5 Buddha families. And so therefore you have, again, we get into this kind of wonderful androgyny principle where the masculine and the feminine are just different manifestations of luminosity and emptiness. And so there again, you have a kind of balancing component with the feminine principle of Vajrayogini, where at the throat center you visualize this lotus with the 5 seed syllables. And in a certain way, it's fantastic because it's like the Dakinis and the Dakas are tucking you into sleep, right? So you're actually all snugly and cuddled in, and you get tucked into sleep by the Buddhas. And I love it. This is the magic of the Vajrayana. This is the magic of Tantra. This is the kind of secret sauce of what brings about lucidity using just energetics, as principles that can absolutely positively help us, that can actually facilitate, trigger lucidity in unconventional ways. And that's why these kind of tantric traditions have such amazing power, in my opinion. So I'll pause and come up for air around that, but I think that may be an initial first serve, so to speak.
It was really, really beautiful to hear you speak about this sense of being kind of tucked into sleep, the protectors around.
Absolutely.
There's a real sense that I'm interested in the intersections between the experience of Yoga Nidra states, of that state, and the practices that can lead to lucidity and dream, because it seems that Yoga Nidra is like a kind of, it can be a daytime practice of you know, consciously feeling what it's like to surrender to the power of, in the Hindu Tantra tradition, it's Nidra Shakti.
Right.
And she even brings Vishnu, the great preserver, to horizontal. It's her power. So it's like, it's very beautiful to hear this, because I hear an intersection. There's definitely an intersection within the Hindu Tantra that these yantras are part of, because Chinnamasta is Vajra Yogini. When I showed the front cover of Yoni Shakti to Lama Zambo, she was like, oh, that's Vajra Yogini. And I was like, oh, who knew? I saw a real beautiful intersection. So it's
Great.
Can you speak about this, the practice then? Is Vajra Yogini within the practice of dream yoga, or she's what's required for you to arise in that state? You know?
Oh, great question. What a great question. Both. Because again, so when we talk about Vajra Yogini, there's outer, inner, secret, and so outer is, you know, the arising. You know, it's as if, again, I don't have a picture of her, but you know, it's like a photograph of this deity, and you arise, you visualize yourself as her, and so there's that outer manifestation that that frames the entire trajectory, as I alluded to. But then it gets even more compelling when you start to work with inner Vajra Yogini. And the inner Vajra Yogini is the very subtle system of the prana nadi bindu, Tsalung Tigli in Tibetan, where, again, as I mentioned earlier, dream yoga is an inner yoga, where you engage in the anatomy and physiology of the subtle body, in fact, as a way to invoke lucidity using the principles of the winds and how they're directed by your awareness, by the mantras, into these chakras, which is then concentrations of energy. So for instance, in the Buddhist system, when you're dreaming, the bindus accrete at the heart, at the throat center. And so therefore, inner Vajra Yogini comes into play because when you're engaging with, again, now this is real dream yoga. This is not lucid dream. We're talking real dream yoga. You're working with this inner body, this inner technology. So she, so to speak, comes into play in a more intimate way. And this is fantastic because when we go to sleep, it's really an interiorization process, right? It's like, it's akin to what I often playfully mention, that, you know, when it gets dark at night, you know, oh, we come inside. Come on, Billy, it's getting dark. We go inside. So we abide by the natural curfew of the night. We come inside. And then as we go to bed, what do? Well, we come inside even more, right? We actually go onto bed and we get into our bedroom, and it's even more internal. And so therefore, this kind of interiority, this internalization trajectory is therefore reiterated at yet another level now when you bring in inner Vajra Yogini, because not only are you going inside, you're going in your bedroom, you're going underneath the covers. Everything is I'm not sure imploding is the right word, but I think you get the right idea. Everything's becoming very interior. And therefore, inner Vajra Yogini is where you take that even a step further, because now you visualize within the subtle body. You know, you close your eyes, you actually, interestingly enough, you visualize yourself actually as standing Vajra Yogini, which is interesting. But then you work after that infrastructure is created through visualization, then you work with a very subtle structure. So you visualize it, the main nadis, you visualize the chakra, the Sambhoga chakra at the heart center, at the throat center, and that's where the lotus comes back into play. So inner Vajra Yogini comes into play yet one more time on a more intimate level, where again you're pulling awareness away from the outward bound male, masculine, expressive energy, becoming more and more interior, exactly where we go when we sleep, and also a very deep meditation. And so by engaging in these visualizations and whatnot, you're actually inviting, coaxing, seducing the winds, the pranas, the mind into these subtle networks. And therefore, in fact, somewhat akin to, you know, like what you seem to be intimating with even Yoga Nidra, is you're creating what's called lucid sleep onset practice, which is you're actually greasing the skids by inviting the mind to these locations, because the mind, the bindus go there no matter what. That's when we're in these different states of consciousness. That's due in a yogic language because of the accretion of these bindus and the winds in these respective chakras. So they go there anyway. But what we want to do is we want to do this volitionally, lucidly. And therefore we can bring about, if you do this with real proficiency, you can achieve what Stephen LaBerge calls wake initiated lucid dreams, where you can actually maintain lucidity, i.e. awareness, from the waking state all the way into the dream state without losing it. And so therefore, yeah, that's another way to use Vajrayogini in a much more subtle, refined, slightly more advanced way. But for the deeper divers of dream yoga, this is, again, what makes the Tibetan approach to this really pretty sophisticated.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for articulating that so clearly. And I mean, you mentioned Stephen LaBerge in that process that you were describing about the wake-induced lucid dreams. And I did have a kind of question that is about, as I hear you speak, as I started to dive deep into the kind of technology of how Yoga Nidra works, and I see it kind of reflected in how you're describing about the dream yoga. I just wonder, where did these yoginis and goddesses, Dākinis and goddesses, disappear when we get these more kind of contemporary presentations of lucid dream? And it was like, when you mentioned Stephen LaBerge and all the writers about it, like there is a distinction between lucid dream and dream yoga. And I'm wondering, is the distinction the absence of the Dākini, or the absence of the yogini, or the goddess, the Shakti?
Well, there are many.
I can't find them anywhere. I've been searching around. It's like, I feel like I've been in search of Nidra Shakti and Yoga Nidra. And then I was like, well, maybe you could help me out here, because you didn't have to look very far, because you said like, well, Vajrayogini is like right in the center of the dream yoga practice that you're engaged with.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you, and please correct me if I'm not, there's a pretty darn big difference between lucid dreaming and dream yoga.
Yeah.
Right? Dream yoga transcends but includes lucid dreaming. So you will not find this anywhere in the lucid dreaming literature. Stephen is a dear friend of mine. And he has a very admirable connection to Tibetan Buddhist tradition. In fact, one of his main kind of transmission insights occurred with Tarton Tuku Rinpoche when he read Openness Mind, and actually I think had some direct experiences with him. Yeah. But you won't find any of this in the classic lucid dreaming literature. It's just not out there. I mean, the only places you'll find it is when you look more in the traditional expositions. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking. Yeah. Like where did the Dākinis go? Well, they were never there to begin with. Right. And largely because, of course, the scientists can't substantiate it. They don't have when you're talking about these subtle energetics, they just don't have the devices where any of this can be measured. And if it's measured quite literally, double entendre, if you can't count, it doesn't count, right? If you can't measure it, they're not interested. So I'm not sure that's entirely what you're asking, but that's kind of what I'm hearing.
I mean, it is. What I'm really asking is, like, I found, as you're describing in the history of Yoga Nidra, like Nidra Shakti is it. Like, that's all it's about. It's about worshiping her, surrendering to her, connecting with her. But then when I look at contemporary versions of Yoga Nidra, nobody ever heard of Nidra Shakti. There's a million books about Yoga Nidra, not a single one, actually, with one exception, a recent one put out, mentions Nidra Shakti. It's like somehow the contemporary versions, and maybe it's something similar with, I don't know, I just wondered where they went, really.
Yeah, I mean, what an interesting question. I mean, maybe it's some kind of overt, covert, patriarchal dominance thing. I mean, I don't know, right? I'm just totally, completely guessing. I can't speak to that, especially in the tradition that you're referring to. I'm just not that familiar with it. But in the Tibetan tradition, I mean, Vajrayogini has been there from day one, so to speak.
Yeah.
In the dream yoga tradition, she's engaged in very, very profoundly. And also, I like what you said. I didn't suggest this, but what you said is actually quite important. That in the Tantra, the Vajrayana, and that's what dream yoga is, it's held within that framework, the Vajrayana teachings. one of the most important aspects of Vajrayana is devotion and blessing. And so I haven't said that yet, but inherent within this, and in fact, when you do the actual liturgies, the practice texts, they're absolutely soaking in devotional supplications, aspirations, where somewhat what I was alluding to earlier, you're actually calling out for help. And again, we can say the slight sidebar, well, is that coming from some sort of external agency? Or is it in fact triggering the Vajra Yogini within you? Because fundamentally, what does she represent? Well, she's an archetype of particular aspects of your awakened mind. And so we establish a relationship to her. Sometimes I actually think of these, they're called yidams, the binding deities. I actually sometimes playfully refer to them as spiritual teddy bears, because they're spiritual transitional objects. They're very powerful ways to transition. And this is in the classic kind of Donald Winnicottian sense. Donald Winnicott spoke beautifully about transitional objects. Very briefly, this warrants just the slightest interjection, that where in his work, he was a post-Freudian object relations psychiatrist, actually, child psychiatrist. And he came up with this notion of transitional objects, which is, it's somewhat intuitive, that when children are transitioning away from their biological mother and into the world, they do so with these transitional objects, teddy bears and toys and things like that. It's a way to actually work with separation anxiety and transitioning from the biological mother into the world. Well, things like Vajrayogini and these yidams, these binding energies, deities, they work as spiritual transitional objects, in my opinion, spiritual teddy bears, but now in the reverse way. Because now what you're trying to do is actually return from this world back, not just to your biological mother, but to your spiritual mother, again, to Prajna Paramita. And so therefore, when you arise as the deity and you engage that, she works as a transitional identity from this fully reified, manifest, overt being in the world to a much more refined, subtle agency, which is really more indicative of your true nature. And so that adds yet another dimension. So the Dākini principle is a multivalent one, that it has a number of applications and powers of application at these various levels. So we have outer Vajrayogini, we have inner Vajrayogini, we have Vajrayogini here now as a transitional object. And so I think it's like a fractal, right? The deeper you look, the more you see these iterations of this Dākini principle.
Yeah.
And it's just elegant, it's so beautiful. And it's, we're the beneficiaries of this marvelous technology that, if we believe in it, have faith in it, and then we can engage in the powers of devotion, which ramps it up even further. That's where the real secret sauce comes from in the tantric traditions, is the power of blessing and devotion, surrendering, like you're saying. Then, oh my gosh, this is really the rocket fuel of the Eastern contribution to lucidity. So.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad that that we've ended up here in the devotional aspect of it, because it's really, as you say, it's like the rocket fuel. It's the capacity to completely surrender into these liminal states, into these states eventually of death. The capacity to do it without fear depends really upon devotion, like devotion and trust. And I think that's a really important part of what you're describing. And it's also key in the experience of Yoga Nidra. It's to do with the relationship between the facilitator and the person, the relationship that they have with the power of sleep, with Nidra Shakti. And all the writings about her are all about her capacity to immense power, but you need to just surrender to it. Just lie down, give up.
Yeah, lie down and give up. Exactly. Surrender in the best sense. Yeah, that's really cool. So let me ask you a question. So how do you associate Yoga Nidra with, in fact, liminal dreaming? What do you see as the relationship between liminal dreaming and the practice of Yoga Nidra?
I see that what can happen with Yoga Nidra is that we can almost practice it's like practicing the state of noticing the transition out of, you know, literally out of conscious awakening into, and that the idea of cultivating the capacity to remain present in the liminal state is something that we practice, and it's very accessible, Yoga Nidra. Like, you know, it's an accessible thing, so it's got lots of lots of therapeutic applications. It's helpful for insomnia. But what I found that was really interesting for me is to understand that the liminal dreaming place. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Jennifer Dumper.
Oh, absolutely. I've interviewed her, and I think her usage of that term in her book is marvelous. I think it's a wonderful contribution to.
I found I met Jennifer in California when we were running a Nidra training, so we got to kind of explore this a bit, and I found that she helped me kind of understand it a little bit. She kind of unpacked what was happening in Yoga Nidra, but then speaking with the lucid dream world folk, I see that it's like almost like a preliminary practice, but it can be a practice of its own, and with devotion and with repetition, it becomes quite subtle. People can stop listening to the outer world, and you can start guiding yourself. And it was at that point that I began to see the kind of intersection. It's not when you stop listening to the outer voice or the recording or whatever, you know, school you're listening, it starts arising almost by itself, as if Nidra Shakti is traveling her way around the body. And that's where I think it becomes more than just a kind of preliminary practice, but it's like a way to become familiar with the capacity to be conscious of that process of surrender. Actually,
I think that's really well said. And it's very interesting because that very phrase, to become familiar with, is actually the way meditation is defined in Tibetan, GOM, to become familiar with. So that's why liminal dreaming in Yoga Nidra is really this meditation, the opportunity to in fact become familiar with this kind of plasma dimension of mind, or what I sometimes call Bardo dreaming. Bardo means gap transitional process in between. You know, you're not awake, you're not asleep, you're not here, you're not there. That little no man's land and the kind of froth and foam of perception. It's a marvelous arena. Yes, on one level, it's a subway or a bridge from the waking state to the dream state. But just as you said, in and of itself, it's a marvelous state of creativity, discovery, insight. And I find it, particularly, just one interjection here, I find it in some ways even more compelling than lucid dreaming, in that it's a way to really observe the deconstruction of the narrative that generates the very sense of self. Because when you're actually in a dream, that narrative has already been reconstructed. You already arise in that dream with that kind of default identity back in track. But in the liminal state, you know, the pages of that narrative are being ripped out. And so to actually see that narrative, that deconstruction process takes place, that's unique to both the hypnagogic, hypnopompic, you know, the old language for liminal dreaming, where you can see how the narrative goes offline, you can see how the narrative comes back online, and therefore you can see, in fact, how self-sense ego is nothing more than just that storyline. So that, again, is a really great contribution of liminality, and Yoga Nidra can help with that.
Yeah.
Because it creates these little, very refined structures, guides that allow us to maintain some bearing in an otherwise just bewildering kind of plasma dimension of mind.
Absolutely. You've identified something that to me is really special and powerful about Yoga Nidra, because you're in a place before you get into the dream state, when you arise as your dreamer and you're doing stuff in the dream, you're actually in a place of not being and not knowing and nothing. And to be familiar with that is a really powerful thing, you know, because it's often people are very frightened of those kinds of states, because you're not there, you know.
Yeah. And that is the great gift, or one of the great gifts of that space. Yeah. Because you can really see that construction, deconstruction process.
Lovely. Can I just wind up by returning, you mentioned Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who was with the Burn tradition, he talks about Salgye Dudalma, the Dakini. And I just wanted to clarify, you're saying that she exists as a Dakini of conscious sleep only in the Burn tradition, really, but not.
As far as I'm aware, yeah, as far as I'm aware. Again, and I have asked really high lamas, high rinpoches, exactly this question, and I have found nothing in the literature to contradict what you just said, and I found nothing in my discourse with lamas to contradict that. So if there's something out there, I'm not aware of it.
Okay. All right. But Vajrayogini is central.
Ah, yeah, she's everywhere.
And on that note, I think, with due respect, and I'm deeply honored that you've made time to speak about this, and it's really wonderful to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much, Andrew. Would you like to mention just at the end of the interview where people might most easily go to find out about your work?
Oh, you're so kind. You're so sweet. Yeah, so thank you for that opportunity. So probably the best thing was we started a little platform some 2 years ago, in fact, at the request of people wanting some stability, continuity. We initiated this site called Nightclub. So you can find that at, I think it's just literally nightclub.com. It's an online university, online community where we just support people who are interested in exploring these nocturnal subtle dimensions of mind, not exclusively within lucid dreaming, liminal dreaming, dream yoga and the like, but mostly in that department. And so that's where, we have interviews, kind of like what we're doing here, actually, book groups. My books are all listed on there. We have meditation guided sessions. And I mean, literally almost every day of the week, we have something to support people who are interested in this journey. So that's probably the best way to tap into the things that I do that are related to what we're talking about here. So
Andrew Holecek's Nightclub, highly recommended. Thank you. So important. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to stop our recording now. Thank you.